Hello everyone and welcome back to another Ruby on Rails speedrun. This one's going to be a D&D RPG style dice roller where we have multiple different types of dice that we can roll with. We can select how many of each one we want to do. We can of course, remove these if we'd like to. We can roll the dice and then we can see an individual breakdown of what we did. We rolled a 32 out of 40, which is 1 d20 and 3 d8s. So we got a 20 plus 8 times 3 is 24, so that's 44 total, and we rolled 16 plus 16, which is 32. Now what's interesting about this is we also have admin users set up with devise. The admin users can edit the dice types, which means we can drag and drop these around as well, and without refreshing the page, if we come over here, the d20s will now be on the bottom, the d8s will be in the middle, and the d6s will be on the top. And this also works for our dropdown. So all of this is being pulled from the database. So if an admin user simply drags and drops something in their panel, it will change the entire application for you. We're going to be doing this using the stimulus components that has the sortable and the nested forms. We'll also be using devise plus using user roles, and we'll be using turbo to update the page so it doesn't have to refresh whenever you do a roll. So if we roll the dice here, the page isn't refreshing, it's just having this added with turbo, which is that neat little Rails 7 feature. So to do this, of course, we need to do a couple things from the planning phase. I have a deleted user model here, but we know that we need to have roles. We need to have many dice rolls. So each roll will have many dice rolls. A dice roll will have a quantity and a side, or a number of sides. So you can think of this like if you have a d6, maybe you roll 2 of them. You're then saying this quantity is 2 and the sides are 6, which means we can sum those together or multiply them together to get 12 as our total. And our dice types will be the thing that determines how many sides there are. So all of that together will give us something to work with. But to do this, we're going to go ahead and CD out of here and we're going to start our timer. So we'll say start timer and then we'll do a Rails new video and we'll CD into that video project. That'll go ahead and get all of this started. Now we're using just import maps, which means we'll have to import map the stimulus sortable as well as the nested forms. There's going to be quite a few migrations to run here, so there might be some mistakes along the way, but we'll see what we can do. To get started, let's do a bin/import map pin, and let's pin both of these so we can just forget about these for now. So we'll come over here, we'll grab this one as well, copy it, and then we can hit space, and that should pin all 3 of those. There we go. Let's do a git add dot git commit -m and say this is our init commit. Next, let's do a bundle add for devise and acts as list. Acts as list is going to be our sortable backend library because the stimulus component only works for the front end. We also need a backend solution. Let's now do a Rails g devise :install command, and then we can do a Rails g devise user command to generate our user model. Because we need admins, we need to do a migration, add role to user, and we'll say the role is of type integer by default. That'll go ahead and take care of that. Now for our drag and drop feature, we need to be aware of that and sort of set up how we want this to work. So let's start with our dice types. So we want to say Rails g scaffold for our dice type. Our dice type needs to have a name and it needs to have some sides, I guess, of type integer. So that'll take care of that. We can now create those dice types. We do have to restrict that to admins. Now for our dice types, we also need to be aware of, because of our acts as list, we're going to need to add the positions for our dice types. So we need to do something like a Rails g migration, add position to dice types, a position of type integer. That'll take care of that. Now we don't have any existing dice types, which is good because that means we can skip doing the migration to change those. But now that we have that, we want to create our dice roles, I would imagine. So we want to say something like Rails g scaffold dice role. A dice role will have a user : references. It'll have a dice type : references. It'll have a role result of type integer. And what else? We probably want the dice roll to have a quantity, right? So we want to say dice roll should have, this should be a quantity of type integer as well. Go ahead and run that. Now let's go ahead and close this, and let's come over to our DB and our migrations real quick and just make sure that this makes sense. So we have the role for the users, which is going to be of type integer. We'll set the default to be 0, which will be our user. So let's come into our models and our user.rb. Let's make an enum for the role, and we'll say this is a user of 0 and an admin of 1, just like that. Now this user will also has many of quite a few things. What are we talking about? It's going to has many, and I'm going to cheat a little bit here and just start using some copy pasting. It's going to has many dice rolls, has many types, and it's going to has many roles, which also needs to have a dependent colon destroy, just like that. So now for our roles, what are those going to look like? Well, our roles need to sort of have the user with them. So we'll say Rails G. Let's just do a model for our role. A model will have, or the role will have a user colon references. And we probably want to then add in some references from like the dice roll. So we want to say Rails G migration, add role to dice roll. And then we want to say a role colon references like this. Oops, sorry, a role colon references. My brain is in a different place already. So that takes care of that. Now let's go ahead and let's do a db colon migrate and see if we got all of that right. It looks like we did. So that's pretty good. Now the next question is, where do we go from here? Well, we have our scaffold, but let's do a controller pages home real quick to have a home page. And now let's come over to our config and our routes.rb. In our routes.rb, we're going to want to set up some of these routes to work with what we have here. So we have our pages home. This, of course, needs to now be our root path. We have our resources for our dice rolls, except we're not going to be using all of them. So we're going to say except for the edit, destroy, etc. Now we also need to add in something for the dice types, which is going to be except for the edit, update, destroy. Now you could leave the edit, update, destroy for the dice types if you want to. Doesn't matter. Just do something like that. And then you want to patch an order on the member. This is going to allow you to set up your drag and drop if you want to. We then have our devise for users. That'll take care of that. Now let's come up here to our controllers. We don't have a controller for our roles, so we're going to be using our dice rolls controller for this. It's really not great, but my peanut-sized brain wasn't thinking of that 5 seconds ago. So in our dice rolls controller, what we want to do is we don't need this set dice roll. Let's get rid of that. And then we don't need any of these because we're only using it from the home page. Let's also get rid of the update and the destroy. So now the only thing you can do is roll a new die, because if you leave the ability to edit the dice, then someone's going to come through and say, you know, I actually rolled a 20, because they're just going to sit there and spam their rolls. This means we can get rid of this set dice roll. We do have our dice parameters here. This needs to be changed though. We are taking in a roll, which means this really should have been the rolls controller. I'm regretting this decision, but the scaffold was the faster way to do this. And then we can do a dice rolls attributes, and we'll set this to be something like a %i, and then this should take in, because this is a accepted nested attributes for, this needs to take in an ID, a underscore destroy, and a dice type ID, and a quantity, like that. We can go ahead and close this. So that takes care of that. Now up here in our dice roll, we don't need a dice roll anymore. We actually want to do a @roll, which is going to be a current underscore user.rolls.build with these dice roll params. And then we want to say @roll.dice rolls, because a roll should has many dice rolls, right? So in here, what we want to do is we want to say that the roll is going to has many dice rolls, dependent destroy. This also needs to now accept nested attributes for the dice rolls. We want to say this has an allow destroy of true, so we can remove them. And we want to reject if all blank. And then we also want to give this a scope, which will be ordered. And we want to do this with the created at descending, so we can order these. We can then do a def total real quick, where we say this has many dice rolls. So if we can grab all of the dice rolls, call a .map, and then we can do a and colon roll result, because each one should have a roll result if I did that right. And then we should be able to call a sum on that. Now I don't remember if we added a roll result to this, so let's come into our dice rolls right here. It does have a roll result, so that's good. So we can sum these, and then we can do a max total, which is going to be, a little bit different. And then here what we want to do is say dice rolls.map, and we want to map this with the dice roll. And then for each of these dice rolls, we want to call dice roll.dice type.sides times the dice roll.quantity, and then we want to call .sum on this. So a little bit nasty, but what this is going to allow us to do is take the number of dice we're rolling times how many sides that die has, and then we're doing that for all of the dice we're rolling, so we'll get all of our 6s or 8s, etc., and then we'll have all of that summed up just like that. Okay, so that takes care of our roll. We can come back to our dice controller. In our controller here, we kind of have a problem now, because now what we want to do is we want to say, how do we actually do these rolls? Well, for this, let's do a dice roller service.new, pass in the @roll, and then we can call .roll dice like this. And then we can create the service. Let's come up to our app, new folder, call this services, and then inside of the service, new file, call this the dice roller service.rb. And then inside of this service file, we need to do a couple things. Start with the class. Now in here, we need to do a def initialize. So we'll take in the roll. Now we do gets the roll, or gets the user from the roll. Let me change that again. So we can say @user equals roll.user. We can say @roll equals roll. Let's move this up here. We can then do @dice rolls if we want to with a roll.dice rolls, and we can do a @dice types, which is equal to the dice rolls.map for the dice type. That takes care of that. Now let's do the roll dice method. In the roll dice method, what we want to do is say @dice rolls.each do dice roll. And then we can do a dice roll.roll result where we call, let's change this to roll dice type maybe. And then we can grab the dice roll dot dice type, and then we can grab the quantity. And then let's also set the user equal to the @user in here. And then let's return @dice rolls once we're done with this. So now that we have that, we need to create this def roll dice type method, which will not take any arguments. And then in here, let's do something like, actually, this does need to take some arguments. This should be a dice type and a quantity. I went to type it, and I was like, wait a minute, I don't have anything to type with. So this should now be a one dot quantity. I think it's 2 dots. And then we want to do a roll dice sides for the dice type dot sides dot sum. And then for this, we can just declare this, and this will just be a quick little helper. That looks good. So this is just a little bit expandable now. It's of course not necessary to do this, but I think this will give us a little bit something better to work with. So this is now good for our service and our controller here. Now what we have to do in our controller is figure out how we're going to respond with this. So we do have a respond to with format. Let's do a if @roll.save, and then we can do a format.turbostream, which will allow us to create a turbo.html.erb, or sorry, turbostream.erb file. And then we'll just redirect to the root path here, and we'll just say the error page is an exercise for someone who cares more to implement all of this. So that takes care of that. Now let's come down here to, we have our other controllers. Our pages controller needs to be set up real quick. In our pages controller, we have the home action. We need to do a before action to authenticate the user. We're going to do this for everything in here. And actually, we're going to take this and we're going to move this to our application controller. Just do a before action to authenticate the user in here. So let's go ahead and let's do a Rails S real quick to see how much stuff blows up when we try and do this. This will take us to our sign up page. Let's sign up as dean@example.com with a password of password. Sign up takes me to the home page. Cool. Let's go over to /dice types. Okay, the fact that this works is an issue. Our dice types should not allow us to access it because we're not a admin yet. So let's come into our dice types controller. And in our dice types controller, let's do something like a quick little helper that should not be in our controller, but we could put it somewhere else if we wanted to, but I'm just going to put it in here. And we can say redirect to the root path. You are not authorized to access this page unless current user.admin. That seems fine. So now let's do a before action in here to do the authorize admin, I think is what we called it. So let's do that, and let's come over here and refresh for our dice types. That redirects me. Cool. So now let's come into our console, Rails C, do a user.first.admin exclaim, because we have our enum, so we can do that. Now we can do a Rails S again, come over here and refresh, and we should be able to go to /dice types now. That works. Let's do a D6 with 6, not master password, 6 sides, create dice type. Let's do another one, D8 with 8 sides, I guess, and then we can do one more, which is going to be a D20 with 20 sides. Now you could of course just concatenate the D and the number of sides, but it really depends. Maybe you want to change it to just be, I don't know, like a Yu-Gi-Oh type die or whatever you want to do, special type. So we'll just leave it like that. Now that we have this, let's add the drag and drop functionality. So for this, we have to come into our views, we have to come into these are our dice types and our dice type index. Now, in our dice type index, we're going to run into a couple issues in here because we also have to include the sortable controller. Now, for that, we can come over to the sortable. We can see that we have to come into our application JavaScript. So let's come into app JavaScript controllers. And I think it's this application right here. We have to import the sortable, and then we have to register the sortable controller, which we can just do right here. We can do the same thing for our nested form as long as we're in here so that I don't forget in 5 minutes. We can do the nested form, and then we can do the nested form register, just like that. That gives us both of those. Let's go ahead and close this. Now for this, there's a couple things we have to do, and we have to come into our models again to set this up. So this is going to be for our dice types specifically. So in our dice type, we now need to say that this is going to act as a list. It's going to has many dice rolls like this. It's going to validate the name. So let me grab that. And then we need to validate the number of sides, which we're going to do like this. We're validating the number of sides with a presence of true and a numericality where we say it only allows integers greater than 0. And then we can just say there's a scope ordered. Now you could change this. Maybe you want to allow 0 as an option. We'll give it a scope of order based on the position. So our dice type needs a position. So let's come down here to our dice type. This, that's not our dice type, that's our dice roll. Our dice type right here doesn't have a position, so we need to add position to dice type. So let's stop our server, do a Rails G migration, add position to dice types with a position of type integer, do a db:/migrate. Looks like we might have already done that. Let's do a Rails S. So I probably did that in some other migration or something. That's fine. So let's see, what else do we have to do here? Oh yeah, we had it right here. Okay. So we have that. Now let's come back over to our dice type. We have all of these. What we can do now is start dragging and dropping. Let's come down to our index page. And in our index page for our dice types, we need to refactor this to use our stimulus controller. So to do that, we can change our div around a little bit. Right now we have the dice types ID. We can leave that, but let's add in a sortable controller, an animation of 150, and a resource name of dice type. We then need to change what this looks like. So we're going to wrap all of this inside of a div sortable update URL, which is going to go to a order dice type path, which we have to create. We can then close this div if we want to, save this, and our formatter should clean this up for us. Now this order dice type, this is going to come from our routes, which is going to be our patch order in our dice types on member. So we already set that up preemptively, so we're good there. Now let's come into our dice types controller, scroll down to the bottom and do a def order. And because in here we have to set this up so that it will be able to deal with the ordering. To do that, we can just really quickly grab the position from the params dice type position to I, and then we can pass that in as the insert here. This does mean that for our parameters, we're taking in a name, a sides, and now we have an optional position that we can set, just like that. Now, if we come over here, we can come over to this page, refresh, and we can grab the D8 and drag it on top of the D6, and we'll run into an undefined method insert at right here. Now, this probably tells us we have to go to the acts as list GitHub repo because there's probably a generator command that I forgot to run. So let's scroll down here, and we have the gem install, right? We did do that. Gem file, we have acts as list, I'm assuming. We do have acts as list. So we need to come over here. Let's just read what the error is. Undefined method insert at for nil class. Insert at is for the dice type. We don't have a dice type defined here, which means we have to come up here and we have to add in a order for our before action to set the dice type. Let's refresh again, or sorry, let's start our server. Let's refresh. Let's grab the D6, drag it in here, scroll up. That update worked. Our order is not changing, but it actually is. We need to come in here and instead of doing dice type.all, let's call dice type.ordered. And now let's refresh, and I expect these to change. Now D6 is on the bottom. Let's drag D6 into the middle. You can see dragging D6 into the middle isn't quite working. So what's wrong with that? Okay, let's try this. Let's try to do a Rails C. Let's come in here and let's do a dice type.all. We can see the position for these is nil. That's going to be the issue there. So we have to set these positions. So to do this, let's do a Rails G migration. Set positions, because I forgot to do this. Set positions for dice type, and we'll just go ahead and generate this. Let's come into our migrations real quick. This last one right here, we need to change how this works a bit. Basically, we need to go through each of these and we need to set what they are. So inside of our def change, let's do a dice type dot order by the created at, and we'll do dot each with index. Start at 1, dice type, that seems fine. Update column with the position and that. Let's do a db : migrate. This is a cool way to lose like 2 minutes on this run, but that's fine. It's not actually a speed run, but don't tell anyone I said that. So let's come over here and refresh. We now have a D6, a D8, and a D20. Let's drag the D8 to the top, refresh the page. It's still on the top. Let's drag the D6 to the bottom, still on the bottom. D20, D6, rearrange the order. That's all fine. Cool. Stop this, do a git add dot, git commit -m, add positions, right? So there we go, Rails S again. Final step here is to set up the home page. So let's do this real quick. Let's come over to the it's going to be the pages and the home page. Inside of the home page, we have to set up our form and do a whole bunch of other stuff to make sure this works. So first things first, we want to change this to say has a role or on a roll. We then need to create our form. Our form is going to look a little bit wonky, but bear with me. So this is a nested form. It accepts nested attributes for our dice rolls. It's going to use a at roll, which means we have to set that in our pages controller. So in our pages controller, we have to create quite a few different things because we're going to be using them. So let's do this real quick. We need to do a at dice types. Dice types is equal to a dice type.ordered. We can do that now because we have that set up. We can do a at dice rolls is equal to a current underscore user dot dice rolls dot order by the created at DESC. Although I think actually we don't need to do this. I'm going to leave this commented out because I think there's a better way. We could just do a at rolls equals current user dot rolls dot ordered. We could do a at roll equals a roll dot new because we're going to be doing the form building. Although we could also do a current underscore user dot rolls dot build, right? And then we could do a at roll dot dice rolls dot build would also be another way to do that. I'm going to leave it like this though. And then we'll say that's good. Let's come back to our home page and we'll deal with the repercussions of what I've just done in here. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and let's take a look at how we're going to do this. Now we can set up a template, which is going to allow us to reduce some stuff. But for now, let's go ahead and let's think about this form. So first things first, we need this to have some fields for a dice rolls. With a render a dice roll fields, we use the dice roll field. So we're iterating through our fields for, and we're going to pass those into our dice roll fields. That takes care of that. Now let's come below this and let's say this also needs to have a div with a data-nested-form-target equal to target, something like that. Close this div. And inside of this, what we can do is we can, actually this probably doesn't need anything. This is just going to be where we add the new fields when we click add field button. So to do that, let's add a button field real quick. And then let's say this needs to have a submit button. So we'll say this should be f.submit, roll dice or something, roll dice like that. And then down here, after all of this, let's do a rolls div. And then in here, let's do the at rolls.each do, but we don't want this stuff in the middle. Instead, we want this to be a render for rolls/roll, and we'll pass in, we'll pass in the roll like this. So let's come over here to our views, right click, new folder, call this rolls, and then inside of our rolls folder, right click, new file, underscore roll.html.erb. Inside of this rolls partial, we want to set something up like this, where we say this has a DOM ID of roll. It tells you you rolled a roll.total, which is that method we made earlier, out of your roll.maxTotal, which we also made earlier. We then want to order these dice rolls based on the order that we have set on our dice types. We can do this by calling dice rolls.includes the dice type .order by the dice types .position ascending. So that's going to order based on the position of the dice types for each of these dice rolls that belong to this roll. And then we can call render dice rolls / dice roll. So that's going to work just fine for those purposes. Now, if we come back to our home, we have one other thing to consider. When we create this partial right here, and we click the add button, we want to have something that we can add. And we can do that by using a template. So this template is going to allow us to have basically what we want this to look like when we click the add button. So we're going to say this has the fields for as well with a dice roll.new, but this needs to also have the child index of a new record so that we can add multiple of these. This is what allows us to have many new dice rolls added. Otherwise, it would only work with this one and the first one of these. We need each one to have a unique index, which is where this new record comes from. It'll generate it for us. And then we do the same thing in here. So now let's go ahead and let's create this dice fields partial by coming into our dice rolls, new file, _ dice roll fields.html.erb. And then inside of this dice roll fields file, we need to give this a bunch of stuff, which is going to look like this. So we have a nested form wrapper with the data-new record. We then have a collection select for the dice type ID with the @dice types. The ID is what we're going to be using as the value, and the name is going to be the key, which is the thing you see. We then say you can set how many you'd like to roll, which is between 1 and 10, and each value is a multiple of 1. We then have a hidden field to destroy, which is how we can use this remove roll button thanks to the stimulus controller. And then we have the hidden field again because I have trouble reading sometimes. So that takes care of that. Now the last question probably on your mind is how are we setting up all these nested form or nested attributes for the rolls and the dice rolls? Well, that's where these nested attributes being accepted for are coming from. So we have all of these set in here, and then in our dice type, in our dice roll, we say this also belongs to the roll, and then we say this validates the dice type ID with a presence of true. And we can come over here to our home page and refresh the page. So now you can see we have that D6. We can click add. We can click remove on that one, but let's go ahead and let's add 3 of these. We'll do a D6, a D8, and a D20. We'll do 1, 2, and 3 for these. I'll enter in our console, I'll click roll the dice, and we'll see in here that we're going to run into an error. So it inserts all of these, but then it says no template found for our create. Why is that? Well, if I refresh, you'll see this worked. However, we don't have in our controller here for our dice rolls, we don't have this format TurboStream for our create action yet. So let's go ahead and let's do that. So if we come over to our dice rolls right here, we can new file. We can say this is create.turbo_stream.erb. These are really nice. These TurboStream files lets you very clearly see where you're doing things. And then what we want to do in here is just say TurboStream.prepend, which means add it to the beginning. Prepend it to the roles div, or the div with an ID of roles. Prepend the roles roll partial and pass in the roll just like that. Now, if we come over here and we refresh, we can roll a D6, and you'll see the D6 gets added right away. Now, this doesn't look good, so let's go ahead and let's clean up this dice roll partial, and then we can call it a day. What we want to do in here is we want to say, instead of just having the user ID or any of this other stuff, let's start with the dice type, which is going to be a dice roll.dicetype.name times the dice roll quantity. Let's go ahead and let's refresh this, and now you can see you have D6 times 1. So that's good, but now we want to say what was your roll result. Let's go ahead and let's do that. We have a roll result, which is the dice type.roll result divided by the dice roll.dice type.sides times the quantity, which gives us something that looks like this. Now you could move this into a model. That's ultimately up to you. And then the last thing I did was I had this created at, so that if you try to tell your DM that you rolled the roll from like 8 minutes ago just now, they'll be able to tell that you're full of it. But you can see here we have all of our stuff being added. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the timer because I think at this point we have done this. Now I know this was a lot. On the surface, this seems like something that should be pretty quick. But as you can see, it can very quickly snowball into just a million different considerations that you have to be aware of. You have like the TurboStream is something you can just quickly forget about. You have all of these things where you can add like multiple different types. And like the question becomes, do you allow adding another D6 here, or is it like limited based on these? Personally, I think it makes more sense to have multiple of these in case someone wants to, like, say they're rolling 2d6 for this ability and 1d6 for this one. This allows them to like mentally map or visually map what they mentally think they have to do. So that's where something like this might make sense. But then all of this added together, I think gives you something pretty cool. And it's a really interesting look at how these bigger systems can evolve. Now, that said, there are some things you'd probably want to refactor, like the fact that we have the dice rolls controller, which is really just a roll controller at this point. But of course, if you rename this, you're going to have to change around some of your paths. But yeah, that's going to do it for this one. Hopefully, hopefully you'll forgive me that this is a longer video and that it's not really something that you're probably going to use in a day-to-day thing, but I thought it covered a lot of neat topics, and because I can't stop thinking about Baldur's Gate, I had to find a way to make a video that's roughly related to Baldur's Gate. But that's going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.